Well, here we are again. This is lecture two, overview of African history. I wanted to give y'all a little bit background before I get into Congo. And yeah, the first lecture is finally up. So the way I have to do this is put it on my YouTube channel. So just ignore the other things on my YouTube channel and go to the lectures. I'm glad I'm here. Overview of African history. We're going to do ancient Africa, pre-modern Africa, modern Africa, and Africa today. And before I go on, I'll say a word about periodization in African history, which is usually set at pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. That's a periodization of African history that privileges Europeans and European colonization. So they put the biggest part, the most part of African history, which is what they call pre-colonial, from before the colonization by Europeans all the way back to ancient times. And I think that's ridiculous. So we're not using it. I'm saying that in case you take another African history course somewhere, or you take a world history course, anything where they deal with African history and they use that ridiculous periodization. And if some of you may not even care about periodization of African history, you just trying to get you a little taste of Africa. Well, now you know about it, so care about it. All right, I'm going to the next slide. All right, around this goes from earliest times to around 600 AD. And this, remember, this is an overview. If you want to do more reading, there's a slide on further reading at the end. Early populations, just like in the rest of the world, were hunter-gatherers. I said just like in the rest of the world, where life begins in Africa. That's what the archaeologists say. Human life begins in Africa, Eastern Africa to be exact. And supposedly at this time, the world was all one. It was, if you learned it in geography like I did, Pangea. So all the continents were connected. If you look at a globe or a map, they all fit like puzzle pieces. So this ain't no jibber jabber, as they say. Even if you read the Bible, it talks about when the earth was divided in Genesis. So there are other things that show us this is probably what happened. Early populations were hunter gatherers. At the time, somewhere around 10,000 years before the Common Era. Some people say 15,000, but the most current out here is 10,000. Human beings in what we know of today as Africa began to cultivate crops. It was a very gradual process where the people who gathered, who were usually women, don't listen to what this new guy wrote a book that talks about that the roles weren't gendered. He is lying. Archaeology does not back him up. Yes, there probably were men who gathered and women who hunted, but the majority of it, women gathered and men hunted. And I'm going to tell you why this division of labor existed like that. Because women had children. Women were responsible for taking care of the young. And remember, our young are incubated inside the women. Human beings are, they stay inside a woman. We don't have an egg. They don't lay eggs like chickens. And I'm telling y'all this because it's so much political mumbo jumbo going around today that wants to ignore the truth of biology. Because women had small children, and small children were easily hurt in the process of moving around, women were the first ones, most likely, that planted crops. They gathered, meaning, and if you don't understand hunting and gathering, let me just put the first things first. In the hunting and gathering, there are some people who go out and hunt for animals. There are other people who gather fruits, vegetables, berries, nuts, seeds, whatever. Well, at some point in human history, they started planting. And in Africa, it was a gradual process. The archaeological record tells us it was a gradual. They were planting some things and still gathering. And in West Africa, around present-day Mali, if I'm not mistaken, they first started with pearl millet. And to this day, millet is a very important grain in Africa. Millet is one of the grains that's grown all over the continent, and they have different varieties of it. And if you know about sorghum, sorghum is a type of millet too. So millet is little grains, the type that we eat in Senegal, where I go to eat the most of the time. We eat it as a cereal. They make couscous out of it. They make bread out of it. There's so many things you can do with it. So the archaeology suggests that these women started planting that in certain areas, and they would still gather. And over after a while, as they planted more, they settled more, and food security became more stable. When I say food security, I mean the insured food supply became more stable with agriculture. All of this is just common sense. And in today's world where gender roles are so politicized, we forget about the biological reasons why women were interested in settling down to have a secure place for their children. How did children die? Children were trampled by large animals. Children were eaten by large animals while their mothers were gathering or moving around. Children fell into fire pits. Children fell into boiling water. They fell into swamps. Small children, if you ever had a toddler, my children are grown now, thank God. But when they were toddlers, you have to watch them almost constantly. And in this society, we're talking about people didn't have the leisure that we have now. The leisure for you to sit down and watch a lecture, the leisure that I have to sit down and make a lecture, that didn't exist because in early human society, people worked from sun up to sundown. They had very little time for anything else than securing their survival. And securing their survival meant securing their food supply and their safety from other animals, which means building a house. So these men did most of the hunting, women did most of the farming, and women also were the ones that first built homes. And then men would began to cooperate in that too. All right. So during the early period, before we get to agriculture, people migrated out of Africa into what we know of today as the Middle East, on into Central Asia, on into extreme Eastern Asia, and then at some point they began to migrate back from Eastern Asia back to extreme Western Asia, which is what we call Europe. Settled agricultural villages led to the creation of states. States expanded into empires. I spend a lot of time explaining about hunting and gathering because I think it's important. I want you guys to really understand that a lot of things that we take for granted in society today, they all had origins that made sense. Iron smelting. Iron smelting begins around 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. So, just like gender roles are politicized, African history is politicized too. For a very long time, Europeans and other outsiders taught that Africans learned iron smelting from present day Turkey. Like people brought it in, people who were migrating into the continent brought it in around 1500 BCE or something like that. And oh no, 500 BCE. And they found out that there were Africans living in what we know of today as Nigeria and the Congo who were smelting iron prior to that. Just like when I showed you in the previous lecture pictures of the ruins of ancient Zimbabwe, they theorized that Arabs or Asians came into interior of Africa and built ancient Zimbabwe because they did not want to face the fact that there were black people who built that. And the reason why they didn't want to face the fact that there were black people who did that, because it does not fit a white supremacist narrative that somehow they believe that skin color, the amount of melanin that a human being has, decreases their intelligence and their capability. I'm going to keep harping on this because these are the things that lies dormant in the person's mind, and it drives their behaviors and the way they treat other people. And I know the devil is a lie and white supremacy is a lie too, because it comes from Satan's very breath. So I'm here to tell you right now that that ain't true. That there is no connection between a person's skin color and their intelligence or their capability. I'm going to say it again on the next lecture. So if you ain't get it the first 2 times, you'll get it again. Anyway, iron smelting starts around 1000 BCE, spreads throughout the continent. One of the things about iron smelting, it required a lot of fire, a lot of heat. And in order to get this heat, they had to cut down trees. So that was the beginning of deforestation patterns in Africa. Believe it or not, when they started agriculture, they didn't clear as much land because remember they were still gathering also and hunting. But when they started smelting iron, man, they were chopping down trees like crazy. And iron became early on a very important commodity in the trade within the continent and at the exterior of the continent. States expanded into empires. The way you get an empire, you got to have a solidified, secure food supply. The reason why I'm able to sit here and do this lecture, because I don't have to worry about going to the fields and pulling out what I'm going to eat today. I don't have to worry about weeding no garden or weeding no fields, or making sure there's water for the crops. I don't have to worry about slopping hogs or feeding chickens. I don't have to worry about feeding no ducks. I don't have to worry about leading my cows out to pasture or any of the things that my grandparents did on their farm. I don't have to worry about that. All I got to do is make sure I can get down to the grocery store and pick me up something in the restaurant and grab me something to eat. My food supply is much more secure than it was then. But what than it was before they start building. When they start building states, you see a secure food supply. You also see the diversity of labor. The diversity of labor meaning that not everyone has to be a farmer. Because if these guys got the farming down real good, then you got another guys who have domesticated the animals and they got that down real good. They're bartering with one another. Then you got other people who make things. And when you see this diversification of labor, that's when you can build what we could call today civilizations, where everybody's not concerned about farming. Civilizations, cities, where you can have large populations who have nothing to do with farming. This all developed in Africa from the beginning on up to 600 AD. And most of these civilizations happened around bodies of water. One thing you have to have a good civilization is a solid, clear, sustained supply of water. So in the PowerPoint, I mentioned some of these. Of course, the Nile River is the first one. There were so many civilizations that built along the Nile River. We know about Egypt, but people don't talk much about Nubia. They don't talk about the civilizations that happened south. They don't talk about Ethiopia, which in the highlands, which is the origin of the Nile River. It starts from a stream up in the highlands in the plateau region of what we know of today as Ethiopia. Congo River. We're going to talk about Congo. That's why you have 2 countries in Africa named Congo, and both of them are so named after the river. Lake Nyanza, also known as Lake Victoria, because a lying, cheating, stupid man came in there and saw the lake, said, I'm going to name it after my queen. How you going to name a lake after your queen and she lives somewhere else? You see how the devil fool you? Anyway, they're reclaiming this and calling it by its original name Lake Nyanza. Lake Malawi, which is the country in southern Africa. Malawi was named after Lake Malawi. Lake Chad, which is in central North Africa. Lake Chad is to the east of Mali, and to the northeast of Nigeria. There are several countries that border Lake Chad. Lake Chad is a huge lake, one of the Great Lakes of Africa. The Niger River. The Niger River civilizations are many. The Niger River is one of those rivers that curves. You know, the Nile River is the only river that flows northward. But part of the Niger River, it flows northward because it comes in from the sea and then it curves around like that. And it's a very beautiful river. And many other bodies of water witnessed the creation of large, complex states. What do we call large, complex states? These are states that not only cover a large amount of geographical area. They also govern large groups of people, and they organize the labor of these people for the benefit of everybody. And they ensure the security so trade can go on. We live in this type of state and we think it's normal, and a lot of people think that these types of states didn't exist in Africa, and that's false. So I'm telling you, they had them from the earliest times. Because if you look at Egypt alone, you look at Nubia alone, you look at Azania, you look at Ethiopia, Aksum. It was called Aksum back then. All of these states, not to mention the slew of states that was in North Africa, all of these states existed in the BC days. When I say the BC days, we said before Christ. Now they said before the Common Era. These states existed prior to ancient Greece, prior to Rome, and many of them were contemporaries of ancient Greece and Rome. There was a guy named Martin Bernal who wrote a 2-volume book based on how the Greeks got all of their learning from ancient Egyptians. If you take a world history class, they tell you the earliest civilization was Mesopotamia, and they said the second earliest was Egypt. Well, I found out, because when you go higher in your learning, you learn things. Egypt and Mesopotamia were more or less contemporaries, not one before the other. Now let's move on to the next slide. If y'all have questions, y'all come on and ask this question. It's a shame we can't do this in class, because my classroom, we always have questions. All right, pre-modern Africa. I'm putting this from 600 to 1500. And I didn't just pull 600 out of anywhere. 600 was the date, the earliest date that we have for the ancient empire of Ghana, Ouagadougou. So I just chose that one arbitrarily based on that, because I'm an expert in West African history. Across the continent, things were different. You have like the ancient state, we talk about ancient Zimbabwe, I think it starts around 500. African states rose and fell, commerce and technology expanded. In this part of the slide where my picture is, that is the ruins of the capital of ancient empire of Ghana called Kumbi Sale. These are the ruins. For a long time, people said they didn't know where it was, but the archaeologists kept digging. This is in southern Mauritania. That was where the ancient empire of Ghana was. So, throughout the continent, transportation improved, roads improved. They had some technological advancement in agricultural implementation and implements. So agriculture spread throughout the continent, not happening all simultaneously, but gradually throughout the continent, and not one before the. It was more uneven, but it happened because people shared information because of long distance trade. And the larger empires ruled over several kingdoms. So you'll have somebody who rise up and he'll just put the other kingdoms to tribute, and he create an empire. And I say he because it usually was a he, but sometimes it was a she, and sometimes it was a them. In Africa, we do have several examples of what we call diarchal states, where they have male and female ruling together. I named some of these states from around 600 to 1500: Ouagadougou, ancient Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Aksum, the Congo Empire, Lake Nyanza complex of states, which includes Buganda. But before Buganda, there were several other states that started around Lake Nyanza and then kind of spread out. Lake Malawi complex of states and the Islamic caliphates of North Africa are examples of the complex states that arose during this period. The Fatimid Caliphate, which starts in Egypt and spreads all the way across. Then you had the Almohads, which go all the way up into southern Spain, all the way up to southern France, where they were defeated by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. What you need to really galvanize people is a strong ideology. And ethnicity is an ideology that's strong. and Islam was a strong ideology that brought people together beyond the borders of ethnicity, because the Empire of Mali was built around the Malinke ethnicity, but Malinke went out and they subjugated other people. And then the founder of the Malinke Empire, Sunjata Keita, he was a Muslim, but he was a lax Muslim. That was, the people say, okay, I'm a Muslim, like the way people say they're Christians, but they praying to their ancestors, they're doing all this stuff. So as time went on, his descendants, many of them became more Orthodox Muslim. And as they did, they used Islam and the power it has to bring people together as a force to strengthen the empire. Of course, the Empire of Mali falls, and Songhai rises and takes its place. You had a lot of empires right there in the Sahel region that came about, and Islam was a historical force to help people come together. You had some other people who used Islam to their own benefit because they just wanted to rise up. Gold, I'm telling you, the things that they were trading at this time: salt, ivory, elephant tusks, grains, iron bars, and human beings are some of the most important trade commodities of this period. You also had different leaves and tea and things, leather. That was a huge commodity. All kinds of things that was going on. I can't even get into all of them because we're just doing an overview. But these are some of the ones that are most noted. If you look at the historical records from that time, both oral and written, and archaeological, you see there's evidence of these things. Also, other animal products like tortoise shells. People use that, and of course, I already mentioned leather. They use the bones from different things. All kind of stuff was going on back then. So they use bones from different animals for tools or whatever. All these things were going on. You can read about it in the books where I get the information from. Africans traded via the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, and there was what we call a trans-Saharan trade. Because economically and even culturally, Northern Africa, the very northern tip of it, was in what we call the Mediterranean world, as was Southern Europe and that part that we call the Middle East. Everything on the rim of the Mediterranean was in the Mediterranean world. So goods would cross the Sahara Desert, including slaves, and they would be sold throughout the Mediterranean world. So your first African slaves you see reaching Europe. Let me rephrase that. Your first enslaved Africans you see reaching Europe didn't come by the Atlantic Ocean. They came across the Trans-Saharan trade and then into the Mediterranean trade. Most of the blacks that you see now in Arabic countries of the Middle East, Israel, a lot of them have their roots go back far until this period that we're talking about now, meaning that they've been in those places longer than than black people have been in the New World and the Western Hemisphere. Not to mention the Dalit people of southern India, because you had black people, enslaved black Africans going as far, being sold as far into Asia as India and China. All this was going on. Reason why we don't talk a lot about this, even though there was this guy who was he called himself a scholar, but he did research on the African presence in Asia, and he wrote a lot about the people of southern India who were originally brought over as enslaved Africans. We don't talk a lot about it because the transatlantic trade dwarfed all of those other trades by the sheer scale of it. So the Portuguese, around in the 15th century, the 1400 Portuguese were the first Western Europeans to start that their The Portuguese were the first to start coming to Africa. 1500 and 1900, modern Africa. The transatlantic slave trade starts shortly after the Portuguese come. Of course, the Portuguese come early in the 1400s, and they're just exploring along the coast of West Africa. They make it around the tip. They go to East Africa. They go into the Indian Ocean and on down up to the Pacific. We don't People don't give the Portuguese enough credit for the beginning of the destruction that they started, because we talk about Columbus. Columbus goes across to the Americas, and he so-called discovered America. Which, what does that mean? That's foolishness. I mean, the people who were there weren't covered up. They knew they were there. Western Europeans didn't know that. The Chinese knew they were there. Africans knew they were there. And it's just the Europeans didn't know. Now that's the truth. And if you want more reading, I didn't put this in there. There's a book called How Europe. I know there's a book called that came before Columbus, which people have been trying to debunk for decades. And the guy who wrote it is not the first one to write about this. But anyway, transatlantic slave starts depopulation of West and West Central Africa. It redirected the trade, because it wasn't just enslaved Africans that were being sold across the transatlantic. It was all other types of goods, but enslaved Africans were the primary thing that was being sold. Most of it being traded for guns, and because this was such a lucrative trade, wars crept up, empires broke apart, new kingdoms rose up based on this new trade that developed. It was bad. Then you see the increase of firearms. Firearms were not introduced into Africa because of the slave trade, but they increased significantly. Whereas certain smaller groups of people that were already always being raided for slaves, they went and got their own firearms, and so now everybody's packing and they shooting each other, and the death tolls were terrible. Who was sold into slavery? Your most important population in any civilization. The group of people from 15 to about 25. These are the people that they wanted. Young people. You guys, most of you, my students, fit into that age group. It's you that make a society. And your age group is shrinking in America because people are having fewer children. Our civilization is on a decline because of that. You can talk about all this foolishness you want to, but without demographics, you don't have nothing. And then people, I'm getting on the soapbox, but hey, ain't none of y'all in here to ask no questions. So I'm gonna go and say what I'm gonna say. People up here talking about this the problems with immigration. Oh, all the people coming over, they're coming over. We ain't got no people here. Look at all the empty spaces in America. Let them come over, give them a place to stay. Hey, let them work. Maybe they can help build our economy. One of the problems in our economy, over 1 million people died because of COVID. Folks don't talk about that. Well, let me stop because I'm getting bothered right now. Transatlantic slave trade comes, depopulates a whole section of Africa, Western Africa, and it was really, really bad. The majority of the enslaved Africans who came, something like 33% of them, when I say the majority, because if you look at the list of all the different ethnicities where the people came from, the majority of them came from Angola, Cameroon, Nigeria, Central West Africa, that area, Togo, Benin. You hear about people talking about voodoo, 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 voodoo. That's the religion of the Fon people who come from present-day Gabon, Togo area. Fon, Fon people. That's where those people come from. That's where the religion comes from. You hear people talk about Santeria. That's a new world resurrection of the Yoruba religion from Nigeria. All that happened here because so many people came from there. And when you look at the English language, the way we speak it, so many of our terms come from either Yoruba or Igbo. You have a lot of terms from the languages of Angola too. Can't think of the names of the language right now. I was just telling my kid today that one of my children, I was telling them there are a lot of words of African origin in the English language. Let's take, for example, okra, or gumbo, which is another word for okra. Neither one of those words are English. Neither one of them. Why? You didn't have that vegetable here. And I can go on, and I can go on, and I can go on. A lot of words came over. We don't often talk about that linguistic exchange because people are pushing the promise of English. The English culture in America was the host culture. But anytime you have a host culture and a culture from outside, you're going to get some things from the other culture from outside. It's going to happen. And it ain't just rap and Congo music and samba dancing and all this other stuff that people know come directly from Africa, but they forget about the things that we say and do every day. All right, transatlantic slave trade, like I said before, it dwarfed the trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade in scale and commodities. Fed wars, we already talked about that. Europeans, because the trade slows down in the 1830s because the British decided to outlaw it, and they decided they were going to be the police of the whole world. So they stopped people, like the Portuguese were still bringing enslaved African over, but the British were stopping them. British were even rescuing enslaved Africans and bringing them back to Africa. That's why you got the Creole people of Sierra Leone, because they were just picking up ships of people, don't care where you came from, and dropping them in their colony in Sierra Leone. Happened. But Europeans also began to take advantage of these weakened states and began to conquer them. They could not conquer them early on. Why couldn't they conquer them early on? Because they had a numerical disadvantage. Europeans had firearms, but firearms in the 1400s and 1500s and 1600s were not reliable. Anytime you fired off a muzzle loader, you had 50% chance of it blowing up in your face and 50% chance of it actually propelling the ball out to shoot somebody. And they were fighting armies that were highly efficient with spears and with arrows and bows. There's other stories that we don't talk about in African history. There are records of many battles that Europeans lost early on. Towards the end of the 19th century, which is the 1800s, Europeans agreed amongst themselves that the modern weapons they were not going to allow to get in the hands of Africans. There were two groups that violated this with Ethiopia: the French, the British, and the Russians. That's why Ethiopia was able to definitively defeat Italy in 1896. But they held to this with Africans throughout the rest of the continent. And this is why we see you had African armies in the 1800s and early 1900s who could build a musket. They had their engineers who could build a musket from scratch. They already knew how to smelt iron. They figured out how to make gunpowder. They had wood. They had everything they needed, and they made their own muskets. They did it. In the popular imagination, it's counterintuitive to think about Africans and technology and advances, but that counterintuitiveness is based on white supremacy because Africans are human beings just like everybody else, and they have the capability of building things. Look to the left of your slide. This picture of that church, that's one of the stone churches of Lalibela. There's 13 of them carved out of solid blocks of stone. This one you have to go down stairs to get into the church because it was a solid block of stone and they just cut down into it, and the church is shaped like a cross. So they had engineers, they did it, and if the pyramids don't prove it to you, ain't nothing else I could say. But the Europeans made a deal. And they said, we got to conquer these places. First, they had to organize themselves. and Europeans met at the Congress of Berlin. They decided which areas was going to belong to which European country. They decided they weren't going to fight each other anymore because initially they were fighting each other. They made treaties with one another, and then they went to conquering the lands that they had all agreed would go to whomever would get it. And they used African ethnicities, African kingdoms, played them off against one another so they could get what they wanted. By the early 20th century, that's the early 1900s, around 80 to 85% of Africa was either claimed or conquered by a European nation. So the picture there is a picture of Samori Toure. He fought the French for 20 years. Finally, he was defeated. He had an Army Corps of Engineers that could make muskets, and the French really defeated him. One of the things that they had over him was automatic weapons. They came in the late 1800s, and they got him. 1898, they caught him. That's him sitting there with his prayer beads. He had the Wasulu Empire that he once moved the whole empire away from the French. European colonization created a system of organized pillage and extraction. This is the system that's still in place today in most African nations. Colonization weakened Africa economically, demographically, socially, epistemologically. The epistemic violence that occurred was the efforts of Europeans trying to uplift Africans or create black versions of themselves with their education systems and in their version of Christianity and so on and so forth. And the new nations were the creations of Europeans. Europeans created these new nations. They drew the map according to what they wanted. They didn't care about the logic of the people who were already there. They just drew these maps out of nothing. And then when colonization ends, because they've extracted, they said we have a system of extraction that will cost us less. They started with neocolonization. And they used the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and structural readjustment plans to further keep Africans in economic bondage. One of the things they did was to make sure African leaders were people that they could manipulate and trust. To this day, well, up until recently, I know in Senegal, where I do my research, when a guy wanted to be president, he first went to France. And he sought the blessings of the French president of the French aristocrats, the people who run the French government. And if he had that, then he get their backing, he'd come and run for president. And everybody who did it won eventually. Have a new guy that's running and said, nope, I don't need that. So Europeans and Americans met in New Hampshire at Bretton Woods to decide upon an economic plan to avoid another Great Depression and all the stuff that happened after World War One. This was towards the end of World War Two when the war was winding down. They did that, and in the process of it, they created these global financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Well, in the 70s and 80s, African governments were going through problems. They created these new governments. They were paying their government bureaucrats reasonable salaries. They were funding hospitals, funding schools, and they ran into some issues. So they sought loans from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were loaning other countries money at the same time because there was an economic slowdown throughout the entire world at this time in the 70s and the 80s. There was economic slowdown everywhere. But these two institutions were racist in their treatment of African countries because they said, we'll loan you the money you want, but on certain conditions. you have to agree to change your economy and your spending to go along with what we say. Now, what kind of sense that make? If you want a house, you go down to the bank. There's no bank say, okay, we'll loan you the money if you agree to let us come in and manage your money for you. No, don't do that. Some banks ask for your budget, to make sure that you are able to make the note, but they don't do that. Why did the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank decide to do it? They wanted to weaken these African countries, and they weakened them. The structural adjustment programs, including the defunding of public structures, defunding of schools, defunding of armies, defunding of highways and maintenance, and all the other things that a government should provide for its people. They defunded all of that. Then they devalued the currencies. I was in college. One of my friends was from Niger. And he told me he was going through some stress because he came from a wealthy family. His family told him, we're having struggle paying your tuition because they devalued the currency. So the currency of Niger at the time was the franc CFA. In order for them to pay his tuition, they had to pay like 4 to 5 times of the money that they did when he first came to school there in Arkansas, where I went to school. He had to get a job for the first time in his life. He got a job in the dish room at the cafeteria. And then things evened out about a year or so. But the devaluation of the money made the currency stronger. It did make the currency stronger, but that's about the only thing that they came through that had any good effects. Everything else was terrible. And when you have this disruption in civil society, people rebel. And then the army reacted. So you had violent military coup d'etat throughout the continent, not in every country, but in most of the countries. So you had dictators running the countries, and then the dictators just made deals with these international European or American run agencies in exchange for them to give them money and leave them alone, let them do what they want to do. So these people continue to extract money from their government, money that was sent by the IMF, borrowed from the World Bank, money that was given to them by donor nations like the US. They would take that money and extract it, put it in their own bank accounts. They recently overthrew the leader of Gabon called Bongo, Ali Bongo. His father had so many hundreds of millions of dollars, billions now, in banks in France. You had Mobutu Sese Seko, who was the leader of Congo, who was a multi-billionaire. When he died, he had large residences all over the country, and he had billions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts. When Kabila took over, they had to go and get that money back. And just stole. And then Kabila started stealing, and his son started stealing. It's just a pattern of, okay, I'm the leader now. Let me get rich. And they don't just steal enough to get rich. They steal enough where their great grandchildren don't ever have to work it again. You see the kind of foolishness I'm talking about? These are the leaders that the so-called free world wanted Africa to have. And they let those people be in place. The United States of America supported Mobutu as long as he said he wouldn't go for the Russians. That was the only thing he said. And when the Cold War ended, they pulled support of him. He ended up with cancer. Kabila took over the government. Rest is history. So these changes were not economic, they were political, because these people who ran these institutions were not comfortable with a strong Africa. So today, as we speak, there are 3 countries in the Sahel: Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, who have had talks. They decided to come up with an economic union, and they're getting ready to change their currency, create a new currency. What's so important about that? You had several countries in Africa that still use the franc CFA. In Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, Brazza. I think Equatorial Guinea used to use it, but they got rid of it. Cameroon, all of these countries were using a currency that was based on the now defunct French franc. So these countries every year had to give so many hundreds of millions of dollars to France from their reserves for using this currency. So now many of them are backing away from the currency. This has made Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, very unhappy. And I'm glad that he's unhappy because they shouldn't have never been in that type of situation. Ever, 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 ever. Jesus have mercy. Anyway, further reading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. An article, this is a journal article called The International Monetary Fund and World Bank in Africa by Kenneth Nganga Njiri. And the Civilizations of Africa, this talks about the ancient Africa. This is where I got the information on ancient Africa by Christopher Ehret. And the Development of Africa by Olayinka Nkala and Jimmy Olalankan Adesina. And I know I messed up those people's names, but since they're not in this class, they cannot protest. Y'all can read if you're interested in further reading. That's where you can go. There seems to have been, well, okay, let me just leave that there. I'll make the announcement on another one.